Good evening again, and welcome to Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. We are extremely pleased to have you all here. My name is Mark Berry. I'm the president of Schoodic Institute, and we are co-hosting this event with the Penobscot East Resource Center. So you'll hear briefly from Robin Alden in a moment before we get to Dr. Jeffrey Bolster's presentation, which I'm very much looking forward to. I don't normally do this, but I'm going to give my wife a nod tonight. So I received Dr. Bolster's book as a Christmas present this year, which is one reason why he gets to be here tonight and we get to hear about it, because the book was that good. So I think the talk will be as well. If you're not familiar with Schoodic Institute, we are dedicated to connecting people to the natural world. We do that through education and research in partnership with Acadia National Park, and we're a contributor to a transformation of education and research by public participation in science. We are honored to do that work here in Acadia, which is not only a spectacular and inspirational destination, but it's an outstanding natural laboratory and environment for science. I hope if you're not familiar with us, you will become more familiar with us, and we will see a lot of you over the course of this summer and beyond. And just in the next week, there are a couple of other presentations coming up. On this Saturday evening, we have an artist in residence, Barbara Southworth, presenting some of her work and her experience working here in Acadia. That's in this auditorium at 7 p.m. And then next Wednesday, which is July 1st, we have a presentation on 3 sustainable business proposals for the town of Gouldsboro. 2 of them are aquaculture operations, and the third is a solar, photovoltaic solar farm, all proposed for a different part of the former Navy facilities on the Schoodic Peninsula, part of the antenna array site in Korea. So that should be interesting as well, especially for people connected to the community, to hear what may or may not transpire there and how it may or may not affect the rest of us. And take a look at our events calendar, which is at schoodicinstitute.org. You'll see a lot of exciting opportunities there, including more talks throughout the summer. We'll touch on ocean acidification on July 15th with a researcher who does a lot of work here with us and with students, John Sigliano. We have a whale watch event, which is a benefit for Schoodic Institute on July 12th. We'd love to see you for that. So I can't run through all of them. Again, it's great to have you here. I'm going to introduce Robin Alden. Robin has dedicated her life's work to the connections between fishing and the communities of Maine and looking for paths to sustainability and cooperation in those environments. And has been honored multiple times, but recently with a Source Award as an innovator, very well deserved. And I will let Robin tell you a little bit about Penobscot East, who's co-sponsoring tonight.
Thank you, Mark. It's so nice to be here tonight. This is the start. This is a new collaboration with Schoodic Institute with CERC, and we're thrilled to be doing it. This is the first of 4 fish talks that Penobscot East Resource Center is sponsoring this summer, and we, characteristically because fisheries is something that happens far and wide, we're in multiple locations. We have Paul Greenberg, who's another fisheries author, coming on July 29th to College of the Atlantic at 6:30 p.m. And he's the author of American Catch and For Fish. He's one of the most knowledgeable people about modern sustainable fisheries work. We have our own Ted Ames speaking here as the second of these co-sponsored ones. He's one of our founding board members, and he'll be talking about the connection between cod and alewives here on September 8th. And I'll be speaking down at one of the talks that Bath Marine Museum, the Maine Marine Museum in Bath is hosting to honor their new lobster exhibit. So I'll be speaking in August. Again, our website is penobscoteast.org, and all of our events are on that. I also, so Penobscot East Resource Center, we're based in Stonington. Our mission is to secure a sustainable future for fisheries and fishing communities in eastern Maine and beyond. Our approach is translating fishermen's knowledge into really cutting-edge science and building the trust and the institutions that make co-management or good sustainable fisheries possible. Co-management is when fishermen and scientists and government work together for the future of fisheries. Our idea is that while we're working locally, our impact is global and people are really paying attention to the type of work that we're doing. We think Eastern Maine is a place where we can perhaps not repeat all the mistakes that Jeff is going to talk about tonight and have a place where communities can truly fish forever. So if you ask Jeff Bolster how he wants to be introduced, what he says is, he used to drive boats. Now he writes books, and he's done both with moderate success. Well, I think that that might be understatement. He also, and this is pertinent for tonight in particular, given our co-sponsorship, makes it clear that he doesn't presume to ever have been a commercial fisherman. He's caught a lot of fish on oceanographic research vessels, on party boats, you name it, but he's never actually had to make his living commercial fishing. What Jeff understands is that there are different types of knowledge, and they all contribute to our work as a collective group trying to figure out how to live on this earth the right way. And I think you'll see that tonight. The Mortal Sea is, the book that he's going to be talking about tonight is the result of a 10-year effort, big collaboration that occurred at University of New Hampshire. It was, he describes its strength and its power as the hybridity of thought, the different types of knowledge that came together when serious scientists worked with serious historians. Jeff Bolster brought something very important to this, too. He is a trained historian with degrees from Trinity, from Brown, and from Johns Hopkins. And he's got 75,000 miles plus in sea time. He told me that when he first decided to switch from his first iteration, when he had a Master of Steam and auxiliary sail and motor certification as a commercial mariner, that the professor he talked to said he needed to understand that what he'd learned at sea was going to have no meaning in the context of history, of his career as a future historian. Well, he certainly feels that his sea time does inform it. He's still at sea. Every contact I had with him arranging this talk was from him in some port far south of here, off of his boat. The Mortal Sea is his fourth book. It won the Bancroft Prize in 2013, and it's won many other prizes. And I hope that you will all join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Bolster.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you all for coming. Is the sound on this gadget pretty good? You don't need me to do karaoke as a warm-up or anything? Okay. All right, then I know there are lots of other things you could have done tonight on this perfect Maine evening, so I'm honored that you've come out to hear a few fish stories, and I thank Robin for that gracious introduction. The project that I'm going to present tonight, it's a book I wrote. All of you will want to buy them. Christmas is coming. You have people that will love this book. It's the backstory to the contemporary fishing crisis that we've all grown up with. I'm a historian. I partnered for 10 years with scientists. Our group at the University of New Hampshire worked in lots of different ways, but it was that fusion, this sort of arranged marriage between ecologists, biostatisticians, and historians forced together that actually allowed us to produce some new knowledge, to answer questions that no practitioner in one area could have answered on their own. So it was sort of exciting, but it wasn't really very easy. Anyway, are the oceans dying? A thought that would have seemed implausible not very many years ago now seems all too possible. Fishermen and scientists have been at each other's throats for decades, and we ask ourselves the question, who's in worse shape, the fish or the fishermen? And we ask ourselves the question, how the heck did we get into this mess? You know, it's really easy where we sit to blame modern technology for problems in the fisheries. It's very easy for many of us to imagine this is all a post-World War II story. Big steel ships, sophisticated electronic navigation, polyester nets. Okay? Sometimes it's sort of reassuring to look back to what we think of as a simpler, more traditional age. People look at this painting by Winslow Homer. He first called it the halibut fisher, then it was later called the fog warning. You know, this brother is out here in his dory, and he's looking over his shoulder at this fog bank rolling in, and he's really hoping to get back to the safety of his schooner. This is not the Sea of Galilee. This is God's great North Atlantic. People look at this picture and they sort of think, well, this is the nature of the traditional fisheries. But I'm here to tell you tonight, there's nothing traditional about this picture. When it was painted in 1885, the idea of going out in a dory from the safety of your schooner was only about 25 years old. Guys had fished here for over 300 years. They hand-lined over the rail from the relative safety of their ship. The idea of going out in a stinking little rowboat, sometimes miles from your ship, lunacy, absolute lunacy. And yet something propelled them to do it in the middle of the 19th century, which actually was decreasing catches. The fish in the picture, the halibut, largest member of the flounder family, this had been trash fish until 25, 30 years before. Nobody fished halibut. So what we have here is not a traditional picture. It's a very historically specific picture of the nature of the fisheries, somewhere between that unfathomable abundance that Captain John Smith described, and then the remnant of these tattered ecosystems with which we live today. This is just one step along the way. My job as a historian was to try to reconstruct fisheries past, try to ask questions about, from the perspective of the people who were there, see what we could learn about oceans past. It seemed to me, true confessions here, I'm 61 years old. It's really easy. I was born in 1954, the year the first factory freezer trawler arrived here on the coast from Europe. It seemed to me that growing up, the sea was still presented through tradition and literature and science as immortal. When I was a kid, I went off to college to be the next Jacques Cousteau. I got sort of sidetracked along the way, and here we are. But in any event, I've been long interested in this stuff, but the sea was presented for a very, very, very long time as immortal, as if humans' impact on ecosystems stopped at the edge of the shore. Today, we understand that's no longer the case. So as a historian, I wondered, how had that been the case for so long? Because it turned out there was a lot of evidence to the contrary. So I got into this book, and I wrote this book, and it went back to some extent all the way back to the Viking Age in Europe. I wanted to lay out a baseline of what was normal when people arrived here from Europe. The book really concentrates on those 4 centuries leading up to industrialized fishing, up to about World War I, and then there's a little postscript that takes us to 2010. So here are my Viking friends I had dinner with tonight. Here's the Viking ship image. If you're pressed for time and you need to leave now, this is the takeaway message, okay? And I think this is what the collaboration between Schoodic Institute and Penobscot East is trying to do, among other things, look to sustainable fisheries for the future, okay? Engage those restoration challenges. My message is that without genuinely historical perspectives, without a sense of what this ecosystem has been like in the past, we have no idea of the magnitude of the restoration challenges we face. So that's the takeaway message. All right, here's the great state of Maine in the Little Ice Age. Long before the American story was cowboys and Indians, it was fishermen and Indians. And the first people on the East Coast from Europe were not here for freedom of religion, and they were not here to stay over the winter. They came seasonally to fish, okay? So here we have the great coast of Maine in the Little Ice Age. And these European mariners who arrived here were flabbergasted by what they found. Oh, wait a minute. What did they find? Salmon. They had that in Europe. Harbor seals? Oh, they had those in Europe too. Eider ducks? Yep, had those back in Europe. Codfish? You bet. Sturgeon? Yep. Same old stuff. This was not like Magellan's guys in the Philippines finding 40-pound clams or chambered nautilus. This was not like Columbus in the Caribbean finding colored fish or oysters that grew on trees. Ho-hum. It's all the same old stuff they got in the Bay of Biscay in the North Sea. But what these Europeans discovered when they got here is that the organisms themselves were bigger and there was lots more of them, okay? Now, we've all heard that story, and we all know that these early explorers came back with these tales that said these American seas were just chock-a-block full of fish. And some people dismissed it as mere propaganda. I suggest in this book, that's the book you all want to buy before you leave, that actually, unless you pay attention to those narratives in light of the context of what was normal for the guys that wrote them, you can't understand them. And here's my point. These mariners that came over here, the ones especially who wrote accounts like James Rozier and Smith and others, Champlain, they were the best and brightest of their age. They were supremely talented and confident guys. And the reason they were alive is that they had paid attention to their surroundings. They're making trips back and forth the North Atlantic in the winter in these little sailing ships, okay? They paid attention. They knew what was normal in the systems from which they had come, where they saw these critters. And yet when they got here, same critters, but the abundances were phenomenal. We should pay attention to that. So by the time Herman Mall did this little engraving of the Newfoundland fishery in 1720, Europeans had been fishing these waters, Gulf of St. Lawrence, coast of Newfoundland, down the Nova Scotian coast, beginning of the Gulf of Maine, for several hundred years. They were still taking 150,000 metric tons of cod every year using technology that we wouldn't even think of as technology, okay? This was a sustainable fishery for many, many centuries, returning hundreds of thousands of metric tons of cod every year. The river fish were numerous too in those early days. Here's a house a few blocks from where I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Archibald McFedris built this fine house, 1717. The river is full of salmon, he says. In the season, you may take 1,000 tons. Possibly hyperbole, but what he was saying is the river runs silver every spring. The salmon runs are extraordinary. 1717. Run ahead 40 years. The people living upon the banks of the Merrimack, next river down, observed that several species, shad, salmon, alewives, not so plenty in their seasons as formerly. People were beginning to hit river fish, the anadromous fish, as early as 1750s. By the 1790s, Judge Chadbourne, South Berwick, Maine. Formerly, large fish such as salmon, bass, and shad came up the river, but they have forsook it. Nope, they got caught, and they got eaten, and they didn't have so many babies. Turns out when you catch them all, it's harder for them to have babies. Remember that. That's one of the ecological takeaway messages tonight, okay? How about Jeremy Belknap? The striped bass was formerly taken in great plenty, but its fisheries almost destroyed. 1790s. This sort of evidence is voluminous, and what we can say is that by the inauguration of George Washington, we have a measurable change in the nature of the coastal ocean and estuaries here in Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Not the deep sea, but in the estuaries and inshore, localized depletions, range contractions, extinctions, near extinctions. The inauguration of George Washington, the system was taking it on the chin. Now, I sometimes pause here for a minute, and I point out the hypocrisy of my own life. It is very easy to look back at these colonial people in New England and say, they killed all the beavers, they cut down all the trees, they caught a hell of a lot of fish, and they put the plow to the land and ran all that topsoil off as erosion. What a hash they made of things. We can look back with that criticism. We can also point out that they ate locally, they created no garbage stream, they relied on local energy sources. And now we have to ask ourselves, what do? I don't kill no beavers. I don't cut down no pine trees. I'm not running topsoil into the river. I fly in airplanes. I drink water out of single-use plastic bottles. I drive a car. I take hot showers. On whom do we wish to bestow criticism about how they're living? So these colonial people were hitting the system pretty hard, but they were trying to get ahead, make a living, set up their families. We can learn perhaps from their examples, but we have to ask ourselves also what we're doing. Okay. This boy was one of the early casualties of the ecosystem. The great auk. This was the North American penguin. It's extinct now. The last one was killed in the Atlantic in 1844. A few years before that, a Marblehead fisherman said, if we don't take care of the mackerel population and not catch them in the spawning season, the mackerel will become as uncommon as the penguins that were formerly so common. This bird had evolved over 30 million years to stop flying. It swam and it dove. And like Antarctic penguins, it raised one chick a year. Superbly adapted to certain conditions. But fishermen realized that cod were not fastidious about what they ate. And if you ran out of salted clams, or you didn't have some mackerel or something else on the boat as bait, you could kill seabirds, guillemots, puffins, auks, auklets, razorbills. They all made great codfish bait. So the auks were ultimately exterminated in part because of the desire for bait. By 1844, they're gone, an extinction. Okay? So that's a little backstory. And that backstory takes us to fishermen here like George Donnell. Between the years about 1850 and 1915, roughly between the American Civil War and World War I, fishermen like George Donnell, they were not using the term sustainability, but they were really wondering about fish for the future. And they were not using the term ecology, but they were talking about predator-prey relationships. They were talking about the food web, and they were wondering how changes in the sea that they were seeing in their own lifetime by the American Civil War were going to play out for fish for the future. So there are these conversations being heard on schooners and stages and in town halls up and down this coast. People from all these little towns in Hancock and Waldo County and Penobscot and all the rest of the places around here. Now, there had been complaints before, but the intensity of these complaints increased dramatically during the 1850s and 60s. This is very, very significant. It's very dramatic. So as a historian, I'd say, well, there's a turning point here. Something changed, okay? Real concerns about true sea fish, cod and mackerel and menhaden and herring. And fishermen are saying, we're in trouble. Fishermen are saying we're in trouble. So the question I pose to you is why and what changed perceptions and attitudes? Why were fishermen in Maine and Massachusetts and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland complaining and worrying in the 1850s and 60s? We can say that this period, what I'm going to talk about here this evening, Robin, where's Robin? Oh, now, is this a 4-hour talk tonight? Did you want the 4-hour talk? Okay, all right, we got one in the back. We'll compress it a little bit. So this period, 1850, 1915, it's a period in which we can see demonstrably changes in the sea. We can actually measure and look to see how things were changing. We can also see a sea change in attitudes about ocean resources, okay? New stories, narratives about the nature of the sea, about people's future with the sea. And it's also a period in which many fishermen are actively seeking regulation of gear, seeking restrictions, seeking closed areas, closed seasons, because of their concerns about fish for the future. Some of these will resonate with what's going on today. Okay. Let me suggest to you that a fisheries revolution occurred in this period. It's often thought of in terms of modernization, but it affected fishermen's understanding and had real ecological consequences. So I'm just going to buzz through a few things that were happening in the middle of the 19th century when it's still all small sailboats, small rowboats, hooks, lines, handheld harpoons. Again, technology that most of us would not even consider to be technology. Well, nets got bigger. Until the 1840s, all nets were made by hand by the fishermen themselves. Then in the mid-1840s, a net shop opened in Massachusetts. And all they did is they build nets and they sold them to fishermen. But they're still all handmade. Every single mesh is handmade. Then by the 1860s, the kind of textile equipment that was revolutionizing cloth in New England, the Lowell mills and the rest, they changed some of that to, instead of weaving cloth, you could now begin to weave fish nets. So now we have machine-made nets. That suddenly makes nets get exponentially larger, okay? So the net fishery increases. It's still all rowboats and sailboats, but the nets get bigger at the time of the Civil War. New species are targeted, species that had never been targeted in colonial America. Lobsters, herring, sardines, swordfish, halibut, bluefin tuna. None of those had been caught in the colonial period. In the middle of the 19th century, they ramp up. I mean, they had been occasionally caught in the colonial period, but there was no real market, no distribution mechanism. The fisheries here, cod and mackerel, okay? Big changes. Now what we're doing is targeting underutilized species in the middle of the 19th century. New means of marketing to deliver seafood. Fishing boats could take ice out to the ground. They could bring back ice fish. They could put their fish on trains. Suddenly you can send fish to St. Louis or Cincinnati or Colorado. Wow, that's a big change. Bait fisheries intensify. What happened in the middle of the 19th century, they went from just that hand lining, each guy tending a couple of hooks, to now stretching out long lines, which could have 400 or 600 hooks on them. So now each man, instead of tending 2 or 4 hooks, is tending hundreds of hooks. You need a lot more bait. This intensified bait fisheries, and the coast of Maine, coastal ecosystems really suffered. A heck of a lot of fish were taken out of the system in a very short time. Menhaden, mackerel, herring, scup, others for bait. Fishery science changes. Fish scientists such as Spencer Baird and George Brown Good are now in the public eye, and they're saying, the scientists then, 1870s, saying, no, there's no way that humans can affect the sea. These fishermen that are complaining, no, they're mistaken. There's no way humans can affect the sea. We'll help them develop better technology, and we'll help them understand fish's habits more effectively so they can fish better. Okay? Baird and George Brown Good attributed the decline of cod, everybody knew by the 1870s the cod fishery was in terrible shape, to the depletion of the forage fish, the shad and the alewives that cod ate. The beauty of this thesis is that Baird and Brown Good wanted to engineer those fish in government labs and stock the sea, the way we stock trout streams today. They did this for about 60 years. Huge amounts of tax dollars went to stocking the ocean. The beauty of the thesis is that it also allowed them to ignore the overfishing that was occurring, some of which it was the fishermen themselves that were complaining about. Okay, so we're back to the question. Maine's coastal fishermen did not really entirely agree with this. So what led this generation of fishermen at the beginning of the 1850s to believe that fish were declining and that overfishing was part of the problem? One piece of the puzzle is an article that our group from New Hampshire published, Modeling Cod Biomass Using Historical Records. What we did is we looked at the cod fishery on the offshore banks off Nova Scotia. Here's the province of Nova Scotia. Here we are on the coast of Maine. Here's Cape Cod, Boston. So these New England-based schooners, these are from the North Shore of Boston, would go out and fish on the Nova Scotian Shelf. The modern management areas, if any of you are into fisheries management, it's 4X, 4W, 4BS. Those are the North Atlantic Fishery Organization management zones. What our group did is we were able to track individual boats. We ended up with about 325 schooners, where we could tell you at any day of any season over this decade where they were fishing, often in what depth of water, certainly with how many men on board, whether bait fish were available, all sorts of data. 325 boats, and then we had 1,300 other boats that they spoke with and exchanged information about their catch. So we had data from 1,600 schooners in the 1850s, and you could do a lot with this data. For instance, the guys from the North Shore of Boston were not fishing Georges Bank. They were not fishing the Gulf of Maine. They were not fishing the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They were fishing the Nova Scotian Shelf. Okay? I can talk more about that, but anyway, what did we learn? Well, the 1850s were a really bad time for commercial fishermen. Their catches went down over that decade by almost 50%, from about 27,000 fish a season to about 14,000 fish a season. Okay? If you standardize this, doing some math that I do not fully understand, that was the biostatisticians in our group that did that piece, one can create an estimate of cod biomass back in 1852. This is what got this article of ours international coverage. Most of the continents of the world ran up. There was press about this article all over the place because we had this new methodology. What we laid out pretty clearly is that there was about 1.25 million metric tons of cod biomass in 1852. By 2004, it wasn't as good. And that's the spawning stock biomass, the red line down there. So up here, these grounds have been fished already, remember, for 300 years. But it looks like the biomass of cod that existed was still this much. And there's another study with a totally different methodology that had this. So the point is, this was this fusion of historical data sets, contemporary population biology methods, same kind that National Marine Fisheries uses today to calculate fish stocks. And what we did is we answered the question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? How many fish used to swim in the sea? It's pretty crazy, but that was the point of the exercise. So 1.25 million metric tons of cod on the Nova Scotian Shelf. Fishermen at the time knew that the fishery was going to hell in a handbasket. Remember, it declined about 50% over that decade. They blamed it on foreigners, classic strategy. The French were here with big square riggers fishing many more hooks. Skippers like American schooner Lodi, fish very scarce today. French bothers us. They run their trawl, their long line, get most of the fish. This went on and on and on. So beginning in the 1850s, as catches are plummeting on the offshore banks, not in the estuaries, on the offshore banks, as catches are going down the offshore banks, and local fishermen already understand that shad and salmon and alewives and all those fish have been hit real hard in the rivers, this conversation, these complaints about depletion becoming more and more clearly articulated. This is a menhaden. I'm sure that some of the people in the audience know what a menhaden is, and some of you have probably never heard of a menhaden. Mostly, we people don't eat them. They're bony, oily, smelly little fish with big heads. They're really not very attractive. But they are great forage fish. They're also filter feeders. They swim through the water column. They suck up stuff from the water, and they turn it into fats, carbohydrates, and they make food in their bodies for other predators. Okay? Menhaden are one of the most important forage fish in the North Atlantic, but they had been ignored by New England fishermen for centuries. Nobody dealt with menhaden. To some extent, they were farmers' fish in the late colonial period. After the American Revolution, when farms in Connecticut and Rhode Island where the soil was getting worn out, these fish swam conveniently into the dooryard each spring, and farmers could go out and rowboat nets of fish and put the fish in the field as manure. Okay? Then around 1811 in Rhode Island, a few guys began to boil some fish to get oil. But there was a skipper came into Portland, Maine in 1819. He wrote he had been through a school of menhaden that was 40 miles long and 2 miles wide. Ooh, a lot of fish. In New Haven Harbor, some years later, they caught 1,300,000 fish in one set of a beach seine hauled to the beach with horses. So these fish are everywhere, and nobody's paying them much attention, okay? In 1850, the town of Blue Hill, Maine, an elderly lady named Mrs. John Bartlett began Menhaden wars that would rage up and down the coast for the next 40 years. She kept hens, and her husband and son were fishermen, and they sometimes caught menhaden in a rowboat with a handmade net. And she boiled some of the menhaden in a kettle on the beach to make fish mash to feed to her hens. But being a thrifty housewife, when the oil rose to the top of the kettle, she poured it off into bottles. And later that summer of 1850, she went down to the westward on a schooner, and she went to an oil merchant in Boston, a guy named Eben Phillips, and he said, "I'll give you $11 a barrel." So she went home, and her son and her husband started netting fish, and they boiled them, and they put up the oil, $11 a barrel. Within a couple years, her neighbors are doing the same thing. Okay? Charming little story, hard-scrabble people, mid-coast Maine, trying to make a buck. Remember, 1850 was the first year she did this. 1852, Booth Bay fishermen. Taking menhaden by means of seines in our bays, rivers is destructive to said fish, and if persisted, will eventually destroy them or drive them from our coast. 1855, fishermen from Deer Isle, Surrey, and Sedgwick. Catching menhaden will drive them to the disadvantage or detriment of the cod and mackerel fisheries. There are hundreds and hundreds of these kind of petitions signed by thousands of guys in the Maine State Archives. And some years ago, before our team had published that paper about the decline in the offshore fisheries, I found a bunch of these. And I was stumped. What's everybody bitching about? What's the problem? 1850s, there's no industrial menhaden. A couple of guys catching a few fish, and the neighbors are up in arms. Now, it's not like everybody on the coast was opposed to catching pogies. Some guys from Hancock County in 1854 said, "We are strongly in favor of free trade in pogies." Great line, huh? Pogies are menhaden. Fears of a dearth of pogies are entirely hypothetical. The guys from Gouldsboro, no, we don't stop this. It's going to lead to the destruction of menhaden, and that's going to be the material injury of the cod fishing. So what we have in the 1850s is this fracas involving hundreds of guys from local towns right here. And many of them are concerned. I'll tell you a little bit about the research process. You're in an archive. You're trying to make sense of this. You don't really know what's going on. You stumble into material like this. What do? First, you capture it. So I Xerox all these things. I thought back to the NPR interview I heard one time. I'm driving home from the university one night, and I hear the NPR interviewer interviewing the dean of liberal arts at Princeton. And the interviewer says, "Mr. Dean, how do you get such a good faculty?" And the dean says, "We hire compulsives and let them be." I thought, oh, okay, I understand that. So I Xerox all these petitions, and I don't know what's going on with them. But then later, our group figures out that the offshore cod fishery at this very time is going to hell in a handbasket. And other evidence I have suggests that these river fisheries are in tough shape for alewives, shad. And, oh, the pieces are coming together. What I began to realize is that by the 1850s, local Down East fishermen believed that they were at a tipping point. Now, our work showed there was still like 1.25 million metric tons of cod on the Nova Scotian Shelf. But the Maine coast fishermen who had firsthand knowledge of the system, they believed that the cod fishery was in tough shape. They had been catching mackerel and brining them and sending them to the west in barrels to make money for generations. They had been catching cod and splitting them on the beach. The shoremen would do that, salting them, putting them in barrels, and sending them to the west to make money for generations. And now their neighbors were catching menhaden with the same gear and bringing them into the beach and boiling them on the beach and putting the oil in barrels and sending it to the west to make money. And people were going nuts. Something was going on to get that many people this angry about this issue. Well, what happened? In 1864, we have the first oil factory in Maine. It's no longer now housewives boiling a little cauldron of oil on the beach. It's a real factory, capitalized at $12,000. First one is in South Bristol, built with capital from Rhode Island. Then in 1870, we have the first motor ship ever built in America for the fisheries. It was a menhaden steamer designed by the engineering genius Nathaniel Herreshoff, famous yacht designer from Rhode Island. And by 1877, we have 43 of these menhaden steamers in Maine. First industrialized fishery ever in America. Okay? The menhaden industry was capitalizing on a fact of nature. The fish would winter offshore down in more the southern states, off the Carolinas and Virginia. And in the early spring, the fish would come onshore, and they would begin to go up the coast following the plankton bloom. And as the fish came inshore to the Virginia Capes, then to the New York Bight, and then around Cape Cod, they're munching the whole way on the plankton, and they're getting fatter. And by the time they get to Maine, which is the end of their northern range, July and August, they're as fat as they're going to get. So if you catch the same fish in Virginia in May, you don't get much oil. But you wait a few months and you catch that fish off Deer Isle in July, you get a lot of oil. So the industry shifted its capital and its energy to the mid-coast of Maine for these fish. Makes sense. They're trying to make oil. 1879, no menhaden north of Cape Cod. 1,000 men out of work. Factories shut down. Steamers idled. Millions of dollars in capital laid up, no profit. What happened? Well, for 6 years, there was no menhaden north of Cape Cod. Towns like Swans Island, Pulpit Harbor, they went bankrupt. They collapsed. They had all this money invested in this gear. They had no return. What we know in retrospect is that in the several years leading up to this, 1877, 1878, people took as much menhaden out of the East Coast system as they would any time in the next 60 years. But in the next 60 years, the boats got bigger, the nets got stronger, mechanization went into the seine boat as well as the mothership, and then they used spotter aircraft to find the fish. They still could only get as much fish out as they'd gotten in 1878 before the population collapsed. So what we have here is the first time in the American fishery in which the pattern that would become so common later on became established. A fish that had been ignored for a long time is redefined as having value, the menhaden. That fish is now targeted in a way with new gear and new equipment to service new markets that hadn't existed before. People get in, they put a lot of capital in, it's a fused human natural system, and the people push it too hard, and it collapses. And then after some years, the stock rebounded, and they were pursued again, but they were never caught in greater numbers for the next 60 years, even though the technology kept getting better. Okay? So that's a little menhaden story there that was really hitting home right here in this part of the coast. Now, it's always easy for historians to look back in the record and find people complaining about something. Yeah? It's harder for historians, especially environmental historians, to find people complaining about resource depletion and then being able to get any kind of objective measurement about what was really going on. I mean, one of the people with whom I had dinner tonight was saying, they live out in Colorado, what was the forest like in Boulder 150 years ago? How do we know what that forest looked like, and what could we do today to try to get that forest to where it was then? In other words, how do we look back historically at an ecosystem to see what it looked like? So luckily for fisheries historians here in Maine, when again the inshore fishery, pretty small boats, these are the racks on which codfish are being dried, this is Monhegan Island. Luckily in the 1860s, 50s and 60s, there were great records from the inshore cod fishery, these kind of log books each day, each line is a day. Over here we have the men's initials in the boat and how many fish they caught that day. And there's thousands of these log books. So one can correlate small fishing towns, Gouldsboro, Deer Isle, Brooklyn, others, with these little fishing banks offshore here on which these guys were fishing, and get a sense of what was going on in the middle of the century. Okay? So we got some good records from the Frenchman's Bay district. You all know Frenchman's Bay, just to the west here. There's 15 different customs districts in the Gulf of Maine, but the Frenchman's Bay district, their guys typically fish in this red zone. So from East Penobscot Bay, right about there, up to about Grand Manan Island. Okay? So this is the zone in which these boats that were headquartered in the Frenchman's Bay, the Bar Harbor Customs District, fished. This is pretty wild, but in 1861, the year the Civil War began, about 149,000 codfish were caught in Frenchman's Bay. Ooh. We put this slide was made by my colleague Karen Alexander, and she and another guy and I from our team presented this at the Island Institute about 5 years ago. And Cindy Smith, who was then running the trawl survey for the state of Maine, she just gasped. And she said, oh. And I said, I'm Cindy Smith. I run the trawl survey. There's no cod in Frenchman's Bay right now. I said, well, in 1861, I can tell you beginning in March and going to November how many cod were caught each day. Okay? I said, I don't know if there's any there now or not, but I know how many at least were there in 1861. Pretty sobering. And what we know is that just boats from this district, 223 small boats, 45 tons average, caught this much codfish in just that 1 year. Okay? So remember, these grounds have been fished for a long time by 1861. They're being fished hard, and the fishermen are saying it's already gone to hell in a handbasket, but this is the kind of landings they get. We'll just buzz ahead. So our group actually also estimated total landings. Well, let me back up here. It's somewhere between 62 and 78,000 metric tons of cod caught in the entire Gulf of Maine in 1861. In recent years, the numbers have been pretty bad, okay? Yeah, so, you know that story. This is the more important one. It appears to us that the fishery was flourishing. Every small boat out in the Gulf in the time of the Civil War was like bringing in 16,000 fish a summer. They're making money. They're paying their bills. And yet, they're convinced that it's already in deep, deep trouble, and they're attempting to reduce overfishing and save their cod. This is the lesson for us tonight. The conversation that we're having as a society right now, that includes the decision last week by the New England Fisheries Management Council to open up large parts of the closed areas on Georges Bank that have been closed for about 20 years. The discussion that we as a society are having right now about fish for the future and sustainable fishing, and how can we fish and yet have fish for the future, and how do we parse out locally based interests, small-scale owner-operators as opposed to big corporations, all these questions. People have been talking about this for 150 years. How are we doing? Yeah. So this is the takeaway message from my book. Now, this book is a downer. I want you to know that. I want you to buy it. I want you to read it. But it's a downer. I've written other books that are much more romantic, much more uplifting. This one is a bummer, because what it shows is that people made a hash of things. And they knew over a very, very long time that they were making a hash of things. So then, of course, we have to go back to our own behavior today. And I'm, of course, a total hypocrite, because I stand before you as a guy that, as I said, rides on airplanes and drives cars and takes hot showers and talks on a cell phone and has a computer and guilty as charged. Okay. 1862, fishermen in the great state of Maine here proposing legislation to stop tub trawling. That's long lining. They said these long lines are killing the fish. Go back to hand lining. Jotham Johnson from Freeport, if there's not something done to prevent this wholesale destruction, farewell to our fishery on the coast of Maine. 1865. Groups of fishermen from Frenchman's Bay request the legislature to pass an act to prevent trawl fishing, long line fishing in Frenchman's Bay. On and on and on. Lots of attempts by local people to try to prevent the catastrophe from unfolding, the catastrophe they saw in front of their own eyes. So the numbers generated by our analysis tells a story that all of us are sort of primed to hear. There were a lot more fish back then, but in the eyes of the guys who were catching these fish, the guys whose logbooks, whose data we used to generate these numbers, they were already in deep trouble. The tipping point had been reached already as they saw it. So there's this real burst of conservation sentiment in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Maine. Okay? A lot of people engaged in the conversation, and a lot of small-scale local owner-operators, Massachusetts, Maine, Nova Scotia, trying to perpetuate the fisheries, trying to stop the destruction that they saw. And lots of examples, including the state outlawing menhaden seining within 3 miles of shore. This is the most sobering slide in the show. In part, it's because I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I know this harbor very well. Confronted by smaller catches, fishermen are adopting new gear and putting relentless pressure on the system. 1870. The Portsmouth, New Hampshire fisheries employ 10 vessels, that's schooners, with 40 small boats, dories, and 100 men in the winter fisheries. It's estimated that over 1 million pounds of codfish have been landed at one wharf in Portsmouth during the past winter. Here's how. They stopped hand lining. You can't get 1 million pounds of codfish in Portsmouth Harbor if you hand line. But if you stretch out long lines, or tub trawls as they called it, tub trawls, 63 miles of long lines with 96,000 hooks that range from the Navy shipyard out towards the Isles of Shoals, you can land 1 million pounds of codfish. But obviously, you're taking a lot of fish that would not have been exposed to a hook in the past, okay? So the dilemma is, the guys themselves knew this was bad. They knew the fish were already fewer. We've seen all that evidence tonight, okay? And yet, they're fishermen. They got to pay their bills. So they go to a new gear, and the new gear looks for a while to be like a bonanza. Eureka, we got fish again. By the late 1870s, early 1880s, some of those early restrictions are being overturned. We have new industrial interests like the Association of Menhaden Guano Manufacturers overwhelming local conservationists. And then we have this series of collapses. This was really sobering. I mentioned the 1879 Menhaden crash. 7 years later, mackerel crash on the entire east coast of the US and Canada. Americans began to import mackerel from Ireland and England. Every schoolboy knew that the rising glory of the Americas had been based on the fact that European guys came over here to fish. Fish across the Atlantic only went one way. It got caught in the West and it got brought to those hungry European people in the East who had already screwed up their ecosystem centuries ago. So what does it now say about the rising glory of America in the 1880s? Our genius for self-government, our democratic institutions, our rich natural resources. If we have to go to England and Ireland to get mackerel, ooh, not so good. By the 1880s, the halibut were crashing in the Western Atlantic, and guys from Gloucester were sailing to Iceland to get their halibut. Oh, well, let's see. We fished out the halibut on Georges, and then we fished out the halibut in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and then we fished out the halibut on the Grand Banks, and now we're going to Greenland to get our halibut, and we can't find halibut there because we fished them hard, and now we're going to Iceland, the stepping stone to Europe, reversing the trajectory of history. And then the lobster crash, as many of you know, that by the middle of the 1890s, lobsters crashed in Maine and Nova Scotia. They did not come back to the level of landings in the 1890s until the 1950s. It took 60 years for lobster landings to come back. Today, of course, lobster are very robust. We can talk about that later if you want. But the point is here, in the space of about 15 years, catastrophic collapses of very important fish in New England. And the real sobering fact is that of all of these, the only one that had been fished commercially in the colonial period was mackerel. Nobody fished menhaden before the middle of the 19th century. They crashed in 30 years. Nobody fished halibut before the 1840s. They crashed in 50 years. Nobody fished lobsters in a big way until you could put them in cans, 1840s. Okay? So all these crashes occurred in just several human generations of pressure. Here's the mackerel catch, just, you got the idea. This is the jigging spike in 1831. Every single one of those fish was caught on a hook. And then we have purse seining with big calcium lights at the masthead at night. And then we have years of motorized fishing looking for mackerel and not finding them. So here was the sentiment at the end of the century. Towns like Swans Island and Pulpit Harbor never recovered from the double whammy of the Menhaden collapse followed by the mackerel collapse. They just went under. And then we have a man like Mr. Counts, the Maine Fisheries Commissioner in 1892. Destruction will take care of itself. Preservation requires action and purposeful vigilance. Sounds like something you would read in a Island Institute or Sierra Club or Schoodic Point brochure today, and yet this is obviously a long time ago. And by that time, guys, local guys, are using technology of the sort that their fathers had said, no, we shouldn't do that. No. Remember, there was a petition on the North Shore of Boston in the 1850s. If you keep up this long lining, haddock will become scarce as salmon. There's increasing recognition, however, those New Englanders were changing the land, so were they changing the sea. Last couple of slides here. In 1873, the director of the Fish Commission argued for the restoration of our exhausted cod fisheries. That's 1873. That's when the landings were there, about 70,000 metric tons of cod each year in just the Gulf of Maine. Okay, and there was still a hook fishery. And then here it goes to a gillnet fishery and then to dragging, but the catches keep going down. In 1912, Jack Kennedy's grandfather was the mayor of Boston, largest fishing port in the Western Hemisphere. He testified to Congress. He opposed the introduction of otter trawlers, of bottom draggers. The entire Gloucester Board of Trade opposed the introduction of draggers, of otter trawlers, because they said, we've seen what they've done in Europe already. They've wrecked the fishery, and if we do it here, they're going to wreck the fishery here. So Congress had a big hearing. I mean, this went on for months, years actually, testimony, a debate over a bill introduced by a Massachusetts congressman that would outlaw landing fish in the United States that have been caught by these sort of machines. Because the hook fishermen and the sailboats and the rowboats said, if this comes in, we're screwed. That was 1912. Guess what the Congress did? I'll just turn my back while you think about what the Congress did. It turns out the Congress chose not to outlaw draggers. Okay. 1914, a little century ago, New York Times, big feature. Extermination threatens American sea fishes. Cost to consumer has risen because of decrease in supply. Drastic regulation of fisheries by national government declared to be urgent. 1914, more than a century ago. Okay? This sort of puts our current conversation somewhat into context. And here's the rub, friends. Here is the rub. In spite of serious opposition, by about 1925, this otter trawling, this new technology had become common, and now the Gloucester Board of Trade and the mayor of Boston and others were all behind it. No, this is how we have to catch fish. Those old schooner days are gone. You can't get them with a hook. Nope, you got to drag. Okay? So for a while, of course, there's an avalanche of cheap fish. At every step of the way, from hand lining to long lining to going to otter trawling with electronic fish finders, each new iteration of technology momentarily brought back the catches. And people said, we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. And then fell off again. Okay? Look in your hat for a new technology. Okay. Authors always are happy when reviewers get it. You know, sometimes reviewers aren't very nice to us authors, but after my book came out a couple years ago, Jonathan Yardley from the Washington Post reviewed it, and I thought, oh good, all the Republican congressmen will read this. Perfect. Here's 2 lines from Yardley's review. The first line is mine. He's quoting me. I wrote in the conclusion of my book, ultimately the scale of this story, spanning centuries and stretching across the North Atlantic, reveals, as few other tales can, the tragic consequences of decision-makers' unwillingness to steer a precautionary course in the face of environmental uncertainties. That was my line. And then Yardley wrote, anyone who thinks that passage or this book is only about fish is living in a fool's paradise. He got it. Yeah. Thank you.
And we can take 1 or 2 questions, and then we have some snacks, and as Dr. Bolster mentioned, some copies of his books available in the lobby. So the conversation can continue there, but we could take a couple of questions first, if anyone has any.
So I think historically, and certainly true today, that one of the biggest problems you're talking about, the developments in technology, along with that has been government subsidies. And it's like, when are we ever going to talk about reducing the effort? There are just too many people in the industry, period.
It's a great question. You know, the man points out there's too many people in the industry, period. One of the pieces of this that I speak to is that in the 1980s, early in the Reagan administration, laws were passed that made it possible to amortize the cost of a fishing boat in 5 years. A whole bunch of people got into the industry because it's basically like if you had enough income, if you were a doctor or a lawyer or a venture capitalist, if you had enough income that you really paid taxes, you could suddenly buy a fishing boat and have the government pay for that boat in 5 years, and you could go out and catch swords or lobsters or whatever. Wow, what a good idea. So the fishing fleet in New England went up by about 500 boats. I can't quite remember the exact numbers right now, but it's in my book. The point is, we didn't need any of that new capacity whatsoever. These trade laws were passed without any thought to the fisheries, but the way they were interpreted by fisheries people was to totally increase the size of the fleet. And now when I go to these forums, sometimes I'll hear people like Eric Anderson, who's a fisherman from my town at Portsmouth, bitching about how many people have been driven out of the industry. I say, well, wait, Eric, excuse me, look at how many people got in. You know, he's about my age. We have the same sort of story here. Oh, how many people got in the 80s that shouldn't have gotten in? So one thing that has been totally irrational in global fisheries is the fact that many governments subsidize the construction of new fishing ship technology, meaning that taxpayers are paying to hit scarce fisheries resources harder than ever. It's totally nuts, okay? But there is no fisheries czar. We got a drug czar so we could lock up our kids who had pot. That was a good idea. But we didn't get a fisheries czar yet who could figure out some rationality for allocation of fisheries resources. Anybody else?
So my marine biology is a little fuzzy, but you mentioned that earlier people reported, like when they found the Atlantic, when they found the American coast, that there were larger and more plentiful fish. So for lobster, I know they'll continue to grow kind of until they find a predator, but what sort of pressure caused smaller fish? Was that like natural, or like a selective breeding sort of, or just catching them earlier, or?
It's pretty axiomatic that when you begin a fishery on a relatively untouched stock, you take out the larger fish first. Typically, people who are fishing want the larger fish, and often they're easier to catch. And so what happens is you take out the larger fish. Now, it also turns out that fish, unlike people, get more productively robust as they get older. We all know that women stop having children after a certain age. Female fish tend to get older and bigger, and they make more eggs, and they're better producers, okay? So if you begin, as the Europeans did, to fish an inshore stock of, let's say, codfish, you're going to typically take out the larger fish first. Those happen to be the ones that are the better breeders, so you're going to end up with a population that's going to be smaller and also consist of smaller individuals. So if those guys who are familiar with that scene then sail across the ocean and they see codfish, same species, say, oh, they're a lot bigger here, okay? That's one piece. And so this is true for some other species as well. Bill?
I think we'll let the conversation continue out in the atrium. So again, thanks to Robin and Penobscot East for joining Schoodic Institute and bringing Dr. Bolster here this evening, and thank you.
All right, good. Thank you.